I would argue the biggest intelligence coup during the war is the fact that the American army kept it a secret that they were doing what they did.
Debates continue across the United States between those who've received a COVID-19 vaccine and those who don't want it. But what if I told you this debate has been around since the very founding of the US? In fact, this story goes way back to the founding fathers, all the way back to George Washington. You see, George Washington was fighting the Revolutionary War and battling a smallpox epidemic at the same time, and the way he fought that outbreak is equal parts fascinating and a little disturbing. In order to understand what happened, I need you to meet Dr. Joseph Stoltz. He's one of the historians here at George Washington's Mount Vernon. He's one of the top experts on Washington's military history at Mount Vernon.
Washington had been familiar with smallpox even before the American Revolution breaks out, because he'd actually contracted it as a child. He was fortunate in that he didn't die from it, obviously. But what that did mean is that he had immunity.
Flash forward to the Revolutionary War. The year was 1775. American soldiers attempted to invade Canada, which ended in utter defeat for a few reasons. One of the biggest being smallpox, which left the Americans too sick to fight. Around that time, Washington was made commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. America's loss at the Battle of Quebec reinforced to Washington that disease was just as dangerous as the men they fought against.
The number one thing you died of in the army was not the enemy. You died of camp contagion of various types.
So Washington started discussing the possibility of mass inoculation through a risky and gruesome technique called variolation.
The way it would work is taking a small portion of matter from someone that had been infected with smallpox. So like a little bit of the skin or a little bit of the pus, frankly, from some of the blisters that would come on the skin. And what you would do was make an incision in the person you were trying to inoculate and then put a little bit of that biological material into the other person.
Washington had to figure out how to inoculate his current troops and future soldiers that cycled into his army. In order for that to work, the immunizations would have to happen at the local level before the soldiers joined up with Washington. This was a big request for the colonies because local authorities would be required to enforce inoculations and quarantines for recovering recruits. Virginia was the state most strongly opposed to the inoculation plan, which was awkward for Washington because he was a Virginian. The people he knew best were now his most vocal opposition.
Inoculation could be very dangerous to the local communities where the inoculations were happening if it's not conducted the right way and if people don't follow the rules. So Patrick Henry in Virginia were some of the most adamant against inoculations, which again, politically is awkward for Washington because that's his home state. Like he knows all these people. They're bringing up issues of states' rights and the importance of local government. And Washington's like, yeah, but I'm trying to freaking win a war here against people that don't care about those things. And so, how do you find that balance? And Washington will exchange a number of letters with Henry, sort of going back and forth on this issue, where Washington, basically tells Henry, okay, well, you pick. Are we going to lose to the British gloriously on the field of battle, or are we, our soldiers going to die in their sick beds of smallpox and a disease?
Eventually, Patrick Henry and others agreed to take the risk and move forward. The unpleasantness and potential loss of life, along with the restrictive quarantines, were needed for the country's safety. They started requiring new troops to be inoculated and quarantined before they cycled into Washington's army. Washington also had to figure out how to inoculate his current soldiers, while still having just enough men healthy enough to defend themselves. All without the British ever catching word.
They're near Morristown, New Jersey, which is not terribly far outside of New York City, where the main British base is. If the British get word that the bulk of the American army has just been inoculated and is probably sick at the moment with smallpox symptoms, if you're the British, it sounds like a great chance to walk in there and just round everybody up.
Despite the risk, Washington quickly and methodically immunized his troops. Recovery from variolation took up to 2 weeks. People who were already immune to smallpox had to pull tons of extra shifts so that inoculated troops could recover. Washington tried his best to do everything safely, but he ultimately had to focus on speed and stealth. Thankfully, the operation was a success.
The British never find out. I would argue the biggest intelligence coup during the war is the fact that the American army kept it a secret that they were doing what they did with those inoculations, because that was one of the best chances the British had to end the war, and they had no clue that it had occurred. By having the successful inoculation of the army, it meant that the army could focus on its primary job, which was securing the nation's independence.
Washington eventually got to witness the birth of the United States, and that is in part because he was willing to recognize and resolve the threat that smallpox posed to his troops and the revolution. While variolation might have been risky and stomach-turning, Americans most likely owe their freedom and their country to Washington's willingness to use it.